So that's Nehemiah chapter 6, page 488 in the Red Bibles. When word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies that I had rebuilt the wall and not a gap was left in it, though up to that time I had not set the doors in the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message: "Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono." But they were scheming to harm me, so I sent messengers to them with this reply: "I'm carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you?" 4 times they sent me the same message, and each time I gave them the same answer. Then the 5th time, Sanballat sent his assistant to me with the same message, and in his hand was an unsealed letter in which was written, "It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it is true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem: there is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king, so come, let us meet together." I sent him this reply: "Nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are just making it up out of your head." They were all trying to frighten us, thinking, their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. But I prayed, "Now strengthen my hands." One day, I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabel, who was shut in at his home. He said, "Let us meet in the house of God, inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night they are coming to kill you." But I said, "Should a man like me run away, or should someone like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go." I realized that God had not sent him, but that he had prophesied against me, because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He had been hired to intimidate me, so that I would commit a sin by doing this, and then they would give me a bad name to discredit me. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, my God, because of what they have done. Remember also the prophet Noadiah, and how she and the rest of the prophets have been trying to intimidate me. So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence, because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. Also, in those days, the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. For many in Judah were under oath to him, since he was the son-in-law to Shechaniah, son of Ara, and his son, Jehohanan, had married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah. Moreover, they kept reporting to me his good deeds, and then telling him what I said. And Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me.
Good morning, everybody. It is good to be with you this morning. If we've not met before, my name's Micah. I'm one of the elders here at the Gate Church. You might have heard, you might not have heard, I've had a bit of a busy week this week, and so the problem with not having lots of time to prepare a sermon is that you don't have lots of time to squish it down. So I'm going to try to keep to time, so I'll do my best for you. But I wonder, before we start, if anybody recognizes this man. Does anybody recognize him? Oh, we got a good guess over here. But that's right. This is Sebastian Sawe, who is he's 32 years old, and he made history last month by being the first ever person to run a marathon in under 2 hours. Which obviously is quite impressive, isn't it, to be able to complete a marathon. But to be able to do it in under 2 hours, it feels almost superhuman. For context, it's the equivalent of being able to run 5K, the equivalent of one park run in under 15 minutes, and then do it again 7 times in a row. And if that wasn't hard enough, he's been doing all of that while still recovering from 2 separate injuries this year alone, one in his back as well as a fractured foot, which I believe they're important for running. But the thing is, athletes like Sebastian Sawe, they won't be strangers to setbacks. And marathon runners in particular, they'll be familiar with what they often refer to as the wall. That's that point. It's about 18 miles deep where it feels almost impossible to keep going, to put one foot in front of the other. And while practice and physical training are essential, athletes also need to develop this kind of mindset. It's a particular kind of mindset if they want to really taste victory. It's the sort that separates the skilled from the successful, from between those who are good and those who finish the course, no matter what the setbacks. Because in every great project, whether it's athletic or otherwise, there will always be barriers to success. And to keep going, you need a mindset that will deliver you a big enough vision for what's possible. It'll also deliver you a healthy dose of realism, and also, finally, a deep well of resources to draw from. You see, if we want to see our vision for what could be become a reality, we need all 3 of those things: a big vision, sense of reality, and deep resources. Without a big vision for what's possible, we're never going to be able to get started in the first place, are we? We're never going to be excited enough about something to get off our sofa and to start the work, let alone get anybody else excited about that dream. But without that healthy dose of realism, the moment things get hard, we're going to find ourselves quickly kind of tapping out or blindsided by the things that should have been obvious. And none of that is going to mean anything if you don't have the resources to back up your dream of what could be. Whether that's expertise and experience, whether it's an incredible team, just a big old pile of cash, whatever it is, we need the resources from somewhere. And this is true of all great projects, but the ante gets upped, doesn't it, when we think about God's mission for his people. And we've seen so far throughout this book of Nehemiah, that the building project is so much bigger than the rebuilding of just some walls. And this is a vital part of their return from exile. They're being established again as a nation surrounded by hostile would-be invaders. There is a sense in which the future of God's people could really be measured by the health and security of these walls. And so beyond the kind of the usual things that can get in the way of big building projects, we can see some other big barriers to completion. And most notably, we've got this trio of people. They're called Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. I'm going to call them Sam, Toby, and Jerry, because otherwise this sermon will be twice as long. These are men who are not part of God's people and who do not want to see this wall rebuilt. In fact, they probably saw Israel's exile in the first place as a bit of an opportunity to seize land that they'd been ejected from because of their people's sin many, many, many centuries before. And any return from God's people could prove disastrous for their claim. And so what they've done is they've kind of started to up the opposition throughout the book of Nehemiah. They've tried just kind of heckling, and that's not really done very much. They kind of tried threats, and that's not really worked. And so now their resistance is really starting to pick up. In fact, the closer the work gets to completion, the harder they are working to undermine it and to overthrow it. And that is what this book is so valuable for, because we can see in Nehemiah just this example of faith-filled, hands-on, teeth-gritted leadership, no matter what the obstacle, all the way to the very end. And this is really important for us, isn't it? Because the relentless experience of obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, that experience is our experience. Nehemiah's story is very much the church's story. From a ministry perspective, maybe you feel like you've got this strong calling from the Lord, maybe some open doors, and then suddenly you run headfirst into hurdles, oppositions, apathy, fatigue, mixed signals, suddenly closing doors, walls that have been painted to look like doors, all of that sort of thing. Well, that is Nehemiah's experience too. In marathon language, it was wall after wall after wall. And probably in Nehemiah's language, it was probably not enough wall. But no matter what obstacle he faced, he's prepared himself to keep going, to persevere, to complete the task that God had called him to. And just so we're clear on where we're going this morning, I've got 3 things that I want to point out that Nehemiah faced. But I don't just want us to see what he faced. I want us to see how he faced them. So let's get stuck in with the first one. So the first thing he faced is violence. And it's important to say from the start, Sam, Toby, and Jerry, these men are cowards. They are in no way prepared to kind of get into it with Nehemiah in any kind of fashion that might look like a fair fight. They are determined to stack the deck in their favor. And we can see it actually in verse 2. Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message, "Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono." But they were scheming to harm me. They're sending messages off to Nehemiah, trying to draw him out of Jerusalem, trying to get him on his own, 12 hours travel away from the safety of the city walls. And why is that? Is it to chat with him? Is it to persuade him to stop the work? No, they're set on trying to kill him. They're trying to get rid of him before the work can be completed. Why else would they be so desperate to send this message, not once, not twice, 4 times, but not want to come too close to the city walls themselves? But Nehemiah understands this. He gets it quite clearly. And he says it himself. These men were scheming to harm him. I wonder how you'd feel in his position. I mean, maybe we've got people who don't like us, but I imagine very few of us have, like, enemies, you know? People who are lying in wait for us, ready to spring an ambush the moment you get close enough or the moment you're vulnerable. If I were in his position, I don't think I'd have found sleep all that easy to come by, knowing that someone out there is actively planning how they can harm me. But Nehemiah is unfazed. Like, he doesn't kind of reply in a massive way. He doesn't clap back. He doesn't pull together a load of soldiers and kind of ride out to deal with these men. And I don't think that's because he doesn't consider them to be a threat. After all, he considers what they say worthy of writing down. And he makes sure that, we've seen already, that he makes sure every builder on the wall has as many swords as they have trowels. He's not underestimating the danger that these men pose. But equally, he's got a job to do. He has a wall to build. And every sword that he takes to the plains of Ono, he is taking it off the wall, and he's leaving it that little bit more vulnerable. Every minute he spends dealing with these men, he's not leading his people in their rebuilding projects. And you can hear that in his reply to them in verses 3 to 4. He says, "I'm carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you?" 4 times they sent me the same message, and each time I gave them the same answer. Again, I think if I were in Nehemiah's position, I imagine the worst thing I would think could happen to me is that they killed me. But for Nehemiah, that is not the worst thing that could happen. For him, the worst thing that could happen was that the wall wasn't rebuilt. He saw the danger he faced in the light of the real danger that the people of God were in. And the danger that these men pose was nothing compared to the threat of the wall not being completed. His clarity on what was most important meant that he could have a cool head when it came to threats or obstacles. Sam, Toby, and Jerry, they were only a threat insofar as they were a threat to the wall being rebuilt. And so they need, in that case, to crank up the pressure if they want the work to stop. And that is exactly what we see in verses 5 to 9. They send the same message a 5th time, but this one's got a friend. It's this kind of open letter that anyone who comes into contact with it, they can read for themselves. It says this: "It's reported among the nations," and Geshem says it is true, "that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt. and therefore you are building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you're about to become their king and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king, so come, let us meet together. And again, on the surface, there's this kind of like fake friendliness, isn't there? It's almost as if they're pretending to be on Nehemiah's side, like, oh, we just want to clear this up so that you can stay safe. And it's quite clever, isn't it, if you think about it? Because, after all, as that letter gets passed from person to person, everyone will read what is essentially a pack of lies about Nehemiah, and which of them sounds reasonable? Who sounds like they're trying to keep the peace? It's these three men, isn't it? And all the while, the pressure is being cranked up on Nehemiah to act, to do something, to say something. Are they right? Have we all accidentally kind of signed up for a revolution when we thought we were signing up for a renovation? Is King Artaxerxes, this king in Persia, is he going to hear about it? Is he going to stamp us out? Does Nehemiah even know what he's doing? See, Sam, Toby, and Jerry, they want to get to Nehemiah, and that seemed a bit too difficult. And so what they did is they moved on to the second option. They get to the people. After all, Nehemiah is the leader of this building project, but it is the people who do the building. It doesn't matter how alive or how committed Nehemiah is if no one else believes in the work. And so what they do is they use this fake news kind of propaganda campaign to undermine Nehemiah, the leader, to sow fear into the hearts of the builders so that they can bring the work to a stop. And Nehemiah knows this. He says as much in verse 9. He says, they were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. And it's worth saying, isn't it, that Nehemiah, he does act in response to this threat. He doesn't just ignore them. He doesn't just send the same kind of copy and paste response that he's done the last 4 times. But again, he doesn't just take matters into his own hands. What does he do instead? Well, he does 2 things. Firstly, he tells the truth, plainly and simply. And secondly, he prays. And that's it. That's his response. His reply to their quite a bit longer letter is almost offensively short, isn't it? It says, nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are just making it up out of your head. That's it. It's basically, I think, the Old Testament equivalent of like the eye roll emoji. He doesn't ignore their attempts to undermine him, but he doesn't dignify their lies with a debate. And that's because I think Nehemiah, he recognized something really important about leadership, that many of us, we ignore it at our peril. And that is, it's not primarily about facts and data, as much as we like to think it is. It's about hearts. And this isn't a popular thing to say these days, because for some reason, we think we've become a bit like this, okay? We've grown to love thinking about ourselves as if we were like data machines. You put the right information, the right input into your data machine, called your brain, and it will give you the right output. But if we think about this for like 10 seconds, we're going to see that this is nowhere near the whole story. You don't need to put your hand up for this, but I wonder how many of us here have like a really strong phobia. It might be of heights or spiders or small spaces. We won't go into any of those, don't worry. Growing up and into my teens, I had this like crippling fear of injections. Not the, I don't like it, so I'm going to look away kind of thing. It was much more the kind of fear where you end up getting fillings done without anesthetic, and you embarrass your dad because you kicked a surgeon in the chest on the way to an operating theatre. Hypothetically. Now, you might not be at that level. But whether you've got a fear like that or not, you know, don't you, that there is no rationalizing that you can do to reduce that fear down to a reasonable size. Your fear has taken a grip on something much deeper than like our rational brains. It's got a grip on your heart, your very core. And Nehemiah understands this. And that's why he doesn't address these lies with the evidence that he actually 100% has. And you can see that evidence in chapter 2. He understands that this battle, though, it isn't first and foremost fought in debate, but it's fought at the level of the heart. And that's why he ends verse 9 the way he does. They were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work, and it will not be completed. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands. Remember at the beginning, I mentioned the mindset you need to complete a great work. You need that big vision for what's possible. You need a healthy dose of realism. And you need a deep well of resources to draw from. And there's no doubt, is there, that Nehemiah's got crystal clear clarity on the vision and on the obstacles. But this is where we get to see where he draws his resources from. And it shouldn't surprise us one bit, should it? Because Nehemiah is a man of action, but he's also a man of prayer. He's a man of deeds, and he's a man of faith. And so, Nehemiah's response to the lies of these three men is to tell the truth, and his response to their motives, their plans to frighten the workers into downing tools, is to pray. And this is totally consistent with many of his interactions, isn't it? We can see it again, actually, in verses 10 to 13, when Shemaiah, who is a priest in Jerusalem, has been paid off by these three men to cast doubt on Nehemiah's character. It's a bit of a weird aside in the story, isn't it? Here we go. One day, I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabel, who was shut in at his home. He said, "Let us meet in the house of God inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night they are coming to kill you." But I said, "Should a man like me run away, or should someone like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go." I realized that God had not sent him, but that he had prophesied against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He had been hired to intimidate me so that I would commit a sin by doing this, and then they would give me a bad name to discredit me. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I first read this, at first glance, it feels kind of hard to see how meeting Shemaiah in the temple is going to be all that damaging to Nehemiah standing against the people, right? Especially as elsewhere in Nehemiah and in the rest of the Bible, we read that Shemaiah is a priest. He likely lives next door to the temple. Nehemiah is just going to see him at his workplace. But I don't know if you spotted that clue in verse 10. One day I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabel, who was shut in at his home. He's not lost his keys. It's not that he's afraid to leave his house. After all, we learn later on, don't we, that he's been paid off to say these things. Now, the likely explanation for this, apparently, is that being stuck at home is because, for some reason, Shemaiah he's fallen foul of some of the ceremonial laws around ritual purity, and he's not allowed to come into contact with others. For Shemaiah to meet Nehemiah in the first place, let alone at the temple, a place of absolute purity, it would be breaking a huge amount of Old Testament laws. It would leave Nehemiah unclean, and it would communicate some serious disrespect towards the temple and ultimately towards the holiness of God. And why on earth would Nehemiah risk doing that? Because he's afraid. Nehemiah understands that if he meets Shemaiah in this way, he will fan into flame the fears of the people, and he will undermine his own position as a leader of those people. And so his reply to Shemaiah, should a man like me run away? Or should someone like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go. By choosing to stay, Nehemiah is giving more convincing evidence than any letters from the king of Persia could ever prove that there is nothing to fear from these three men, and that his leadership remains marked by integrity, by courage, and by faith. There's an old children's book, which maybe some of us have read, It remains popular to this day. It's called The Magician's Nephew, and it describes the origin story of the world of Narnia, made by C.S. Lewis. And in The Magician's Nephew, Aslan, the great lion who's just sung the world into existence, he appoints Narnia's first ever king and queen. And he gives them a bit of a job interview before the coronation. And this is one of the questions he asks the would-be king before he's crowned. If enemies came against the land, for enemies will arise, and there was war, would you be the first in the charge and the last in the retreat? I want to say as well, as a bit of a side note, for those of us with any kind of leadership responsibility, whether that's in the church or out of it, or for those of us who aspire to leadership, this is kind of like the secret sauce that defines godly, fruitful leadership. And throughout history, this has been the key dividing line between rulers who serve themselves and leaders who serve others. Godly leaders own the mission, and that means they will hold the line longer than those they lead. Leading with integrity looks like not giving up. It looks like fighting on even when setbacks come. It means being the last on the battlefield, even when you could have played it safe and run off and hid. The godly leader goes in first, and the people follow his example. He gets out last to protect those people. And you can hear that same sentiment in the New Testament from Jesus' own lips when he talks about his leadership. He says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. But it's also worth saying the importance of integrity doesn't begin and end with Nehemiah here. In fact, the battle for integrity over compromise is also really clear in the people. And if you were here with us last week in Nehemiah 5, you'll remember Johnny Ivy's really important warning. The biggest threat to God's rebuilding project isn't external, it's internal. Let me say it again. The biggest threat to God's rebuilding project isn't external, it's internal. Last week, we saw that threat in the ways in which standards for how God's people were to relate to one another, they'd started to slip. People had instead begun to prioritize serving themselves at the expense of needy citizens, at the expense of their neighbors. But in this chapter, the compromise is continuing. And whether it's kind of like flagrant and shocking, like Shemaiah and the other so-called prophets who were willing to lie in God's name for the sake of financial gain, whether it's a slightly more sneaky compromise we're going to see in a second. Johnny was absolutely bang on last week, because Sam, Toby, and Jerry, they can throw all the threats about that they like, but those things do not become a danger unless someone inside the walls joins forces with them. And sometimes, yes, that is through the straightforward corruption, like with Shemaiah and Noadiah and whoever else in verse 14, but often it's a lot more sneaky than that. You spot it at the end of verse 16, I think. Sorry, at the end of chapter 6, anyway. Verse 17. Also, in those days, the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. For many in Judah were under oath to him, since he was son-in-law to Shechaniah, son of Ara, and his son Jehohanan had married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah. Moreover, they kept reporting to me his good deeds and then telling him what I said. And Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me. We've already seen in chapter 2 that Tobiah is an Ammonite. He's part of a nation that's had historic beef with God's people, and in particular over this land. And by the sound of things, while many in Judah had been carried off to exile, Tobiah had begun his mission of grabbing as much as he could by marrying into as much influence as he could. He himself is the son-in-law to a prominent family, and he's managed to marry his own son into another one. And by doing that, whether he's allowed into the city walls or not, he has managed to get himself a seat at the table in all the decision-making. He has a voice in the room where decisions get made. And so his disinformation campaign, it doesn't just involve slandering Nehemiah and frightening the workers. It's also about painting himself in as favorable a light as possible. And this is probably the sneakiest, it's the cleverest, it's the most effective tactic that he uses. Because by tying their interests to the interests of someone who is determined to undermine the rebuilding of Jerusalem, these noble families have shifted their loyalties away from the long-term good of the people of God. And we'll see in future chapters that this has a huge impact. And it's really important, I want to be really clear here, that it can sometimes be easy to read Old Testament literature as if it was written with 21st century language. And if we do, criticisms of marrying outside of the citizens of Israel can leave us feeling, understandably, really quite uncomfortable. And so I just want to be very clear. Prohibitions against marrying people from other nations had nothing to do with ethnicity or nationalism or even kind of cultural differences. In fact, the Bible, it holds out to us a number of prominent examples of people from foreign, even enemy nations who are welcomed not only into the people of God by marriage, but whose marriage is used by God to bring about the royal line, the line of David, and ultimately of Jesus. So this isn't about where they come from, but in an era where you come from could largely dictate who or what you worshipped, marrying outside of the people of God almost always involved a compromise at the level of your worship. And that theme is going to become more and more important as we continue through this book. But Nehemiah wants to point it out now because he is clear that compromising the integrity of the people of God will have a profound impact on the health of the people. That was true then, and it's just as true today. But where maybe back in Nehemiah's day, God's people were a physical nation in the kind of the ancient Near East, today they can be found across cities, across nations and cultures, and compromise can be even more sneaky. And in different ways, I think both the church in the UK and the church in the US, where many of us are from, we can have some pretty serious examples of what can happen if the church gets too closely tied up with power, especially political power. Both examples will look different, but both the UK and the US can show us these examples of churches that are willing to compromise on what they say or what they teach in order to hold on to that influence. Another example, during World War II, while Germany was under the thumb of Nazi power, Hitler and his minions have been kind of busy applying pressure to the church in Germany to toe the line, to match up their theology to official Nazi teachings. They attempted to remove huge chunks of the Bible, including the entirety of the Old Testament, as well as to trying to pretend that Jesus wasn't himself Jewish or part of the Jewish people. And tragically, most of the established state church at the time chose to compromise instead of standing firm. And by being willing to compromise, many whatever their motivations were, whether it was to cling on to power or because they genuinely believed these lies, they've picked a side and they've chosen to stand with lies against God's truth. They chose to stand with hatred towards the outsider instead of welcoming the outsider in. Many did, but not all of them. In fact, one man, a man who went by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I reckon I've got a good chance of winning like world's coolest person, he refused to compromise. Two days after Hitler was voted in as Chancellor, Bonhoeffer managed to get onto national radio and gave him and the Nazi Party such a kind of verbal beatdown that he ended up getting mysteriously taken off the airwaves. And after that, he went on to launch a group of churches called the Confessing Church, who refused to bow down to the lies and the pressure of the Nazi Party. They started underground Bible colleges, which sound way cooler than ones you can find today in the UK. But they doubled up as well as refuges for persecuted pastors and believers on the run from the authorities. And just to be very clear, his resistance didn't end there. In fact, Bonhoeffer's, he actually joined an underground resistance group that were involved in a plot to overthrow the Nazi party, including trying to, I think, blow Hitler up, which was thwarted, and it led to his execution in a concentration camp. He was a man of action. He was willing to put his money where his mouth was. But to echo Stu from just a couple of weeks ago, he was no less a man of faith and prayer. In fact, one witness, who was a doctor in the concentration camp that Bonhoeffer died in, he describes the moment of his death in these words. I saw Pastor Bonhoeffer kneeling on the floor, praying fervently to God. I was most deeply moved by the way this lovable man prayed. So devout and so certain that God heard his prayer. At the place of execution, he again said a short prayer and climbed a few steps, brave and composed. He finishes by saying, in almost 50 years that I worked as a doctor, I have hardly ever seen a man die with so entirely submissive to the will of God. And we don't live in World War II Germany. The threat we face for resisting compromise for us here today is nowhere near as life-threatening as it was then, or as it is now for many across the global church. And yet the truth is, the ability of the church to stand up for the truth often is just as weak. Good leaders like Nehemiah and Bonhoeffer are few and far between. And if we're honest, they kind of sound like the sort of heroes that people can be from afar, but the moment we get a bit close to them, we'll see that they have feet of clay. And so if we're looking to the elders of the Gate Church, or if we're looking within ourselves for the deep wells of resources that we can draw from, we're going to come out dry and discouraged. But quite frankly, that is not the lesson we need to take from Nehemiah 6, or from our heroes of the faith, whoever they are. In fact, we've already heard, haven't we, in verse 9, where Nehemiah gets his strength from. He prayed, now strengthen my hands. He doesn't say, my hands will never get too weak for the work. Just put in the reps like I do what I do, and you will be strong enough too. No, in response to his enemy's attempts to weaken his hands, he asks for strength right there and then. They already are too weak for the work. He is moment by moment reliant on the grace of God to provide him with what he needs to keep going. Nehemiah knows what we need to understand loud and clear. He might be a wonderful deputy shepherd, but he is not the good shepherd, and he doesn't need to be, because Jesus is. Remember his words earlier? I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. That's where the resources come from to keep going. Not from within, but from the deepest well there is. From the source of living water himself. It sounds like a good place to finish, doesn't it? It sounds like a good place for any sermon to land. You know, as Nehemiah relies on God for his grace, and as he relies on God for strength, the wall is completed in just 52 days. The enemies of God are themselves, they're driven to fear and to lose their confidence because of what God has done. The end. But Nehemiah, he leaves us with this little plot twist. You see, we are reading the story of the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And the walls have been rebuilt. And yet this is the end of chapter 6. And there are 7 more to come. We're not even halfway through the book. And this is Nehemiah, it's his final lesson for us today, I think. This is where the real work begins. Because the story of Nehemiah isn't a story about a wall. If it was, we wouldn't care about it, would we? No, the story of Nehemiah is the story of God rebuilding his people. And as it was for the people of God then, so it is with us today. The great work has been done. once and for all. The work of Jesus on the cross has paid for our sin, past, present, and future. We are no longer enemies of God. We're his people. We're citizens of a heavenly nation. And now the work begins. The unraveling of hidden compromise, the protection of God's people from threat, both from inside and outside, the restoration of God's people, that is the work that Jesus began at the cross and is continuing in us even today. As I really do come to a finish now, I'm going to give us just a moment before I pray, before I hand back to the musicians, to invite us to reflect in quiet on whether what that might look like for you. Whether there's areas of leadership that could better reflect what we've seen today. Whether there's hidden compromise that we might need to confess. Whether this is an invite for you to stop looking towards limited leaders or looking within for what you need and instead to look up to Christ, to receive from him all you need. Why don't we just spend a moment in quiet before I close by praying? Father, we thank you that you promise us, underneath your people, are everlasting arms. You promise us that even though youths get tired and weary, that you will renew our strength. You promise us that however weak our hands are for the work, that you can and do strengthen us for the work you call us into. And so we want to pray with Nehemiah. We want to pray looking ahead at the work that you have begun in us and are bringing to completion in and through us. That you would strengthen our hands for the task ahead, whatever that might be. That you would sustain us by your grace. And that you would, by that same power, bear great fruit in and through us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.